In June of 1938, Chinese peasants went to sleep beside a river and woke up drowning. The water came without warning. Entire villages vanished in minutes, homes, livestock, children, gone beneath a wall of yellow silt. Within hours, thousands were dead. Within days, hundreds of thousands. And across Henan province, a single horrifying truth emerged: their own government had done this to them. The Yellow River had always been dangerous. For 3,000 years, the Chinese called it China's sorrow, a serpent of silt and fury that flooded, shifted course, and swallowed dynasties. But by the spring of 1938, the river had been controlled, managed, held back by centuries of dikes and levees. The people of Henan province lived along its banks in relative peace. Farmers planted wheat in the rich lush soil. Merchants moved goods along ancient trade routes. Children played in the shadow of earthen walls that had protected their ancestors for generations. The population was dense, millions packed into riverside villages, their homes carved into the yellow cliffs, their fields stretching to the horizon. It was not a wealthy region, but it was stable. Families had lived in the same villages for centuries. The dikes were thick, reinforced season after season. The river was high that spring, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains, but the walls had held. Japanese war had erupted in July 1937, and by 1938, Japanese forces were cutting through eastern China like a scalpel. Shanghai had fallen. Nanjing had been brutalized in an orgy of violence that left hundreds of thousands dead. Now the Imperial Japanese Army was advancing west toward Wuhan, the provisional capital of nationalist China. If Wuhan fell, the war might be over. Chiang Kai-shek, commander of the nationalist forces, was desperate. His armies were retreating. Conventional battles were slaughters. The Japanese had air superiority, better weapons, brutal efficiency. So Chiang and his generals considered the unthinkable. What if they used the river itself as a weapon? What if they broke the dikes deliberately, flooded the plains, and drowned the Japanese advance in the same silt that had drowned dynasties before? The plan was called using water instead of soldiers. On paper, it was strategic brilliance. The Yellow River carried more silt than any river on Earth. 40% of its volume was suspended sediment, loose soil from the plateau. When it flooded, it didn't just drown. It buried. It turned farmland into swamps, roads into lakes, entire landscapes unrecognizable. If they could breach the dikes northeast of Zhengzhou, near a village called Huayuankou, the flood would spread east and south, directly into the path of the Japanese army. It would slow them. Maybe stop them. Buy time. But there was a cost. The flood zone wasn't empty. It was home to millions of Chinese civilians. June 4, 1938. Nationalist troops arrived at Huayuankou under cover of darkness. Farmers watched, confused, as soldiers began digging at the base of the dike. Explosives were planted. No evacuation orders were given. No warnings. The operation was secret because if the population knew, they would flee, and fleeing civilians would alert the Japanese. At dawn on June 9th, the charges detonated. The dike exploded, and the Yellow River, swollen with spring floods, found the breach. Pause. What happened next was not a flood. It was an apocalypse. The river didn't trickle. It roared. A wall of water 20 feet high smashed through the gap, carrying with it millions of tons of yellow silt. The sound was described by survivors as a continuous thunderclap, a roar that swallowed all other noise. Villages directly in the path were obliterated in seconds. Homes built of earth dissolved like sugar. Families sleeping in their beds were torn apart by the current. Farmers in their fields looked up to see a brown horizon rushing toward them and had no time to run. The water moved faster than a horse could gallop. Children were ripped from their mothers' arms. The elderly drowned in their homes. Livestock, pigs, chickens, oxen, were swept away in a churning mass of debris and bodies. The flood spread across 54,000 square kilometers. That's the size of Switzerland. Entire counties vanished beneath the water. 4,000 villages were destroyed in the first week. 11 cities were flooded. The water didn't just kill by drowning. The silt was the true killer. It filled lungs, weighted down clothing, turned the flood into a moving grave. People who managed to swim found themselves dragged under by the sheer density of the sediment. Those who climbed to rooftops watched the water rise higher, then higher, until there was nowhere left to go. And then the roofs collapsed. Survivors described walking through fields of corpses. Bodies floated face down in the yellow sludge, bloated, unrecognizable. Entire families were found drowned together, still holding each other. Farmers who had survived the initial wave returned to find their villages erased, not damaged, erased. The landmarks they had known their entire lives were gone. The river had changed course. What had been dry land was now a lake. What had been a lake was now a field of mud and death. And in the chaos, disease followed. Cholera erupted in refugee camps. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Starvation came next. Millions of acres of farmland were destroyed just before harvest. The crops rotted underwater. Grain stores were washed away. The survivors had nothing to eat. The death toll will never be known with certainty. The nationalist government never admitted to the act until years later. Early estimates ranged from 400,000 to 500,000 dead. Modern historians believe the number was closer to 800,000, possibly 900,000. Some studies suggest the total death toll, including famine and disease over the following years, exceeded 1 million. To put that in perspective, more Chinese civilians died in this flood than Japanese soldiers were killed in the entire Battle of Shanghai. The very people the flood was meant to protect were slaughtered by it. And the Japanese? They were barely slowed. The Imperial Army adapted. They moved north, circled the flood zone, and continued their advance. Wuhan fell in October 1938, just 4 months later. The flood had bought Chiang Kai-shek a few weeks. In exchange, nearly 1 million of his own people were dead. The survivors became refugees. 11 million people were displaced. Entire communities scattered across provinces, searching for food, shelter, family members who might still be alive. Refugee camps swelled with starving, sick, traumatized masses. The nationalist government provided little aid. Resources were focused on the war. The flooded region was simply abandoned. The Yellow River, now flowing through its new course, continued to devastate the area for years. It wouldn't return to its original path until 1947, 9 years later, and even then, only through deliberate re-engineering. The land itself was poisoned. The silt had buried fields under meters of sediment. Farmland that had fed millions was rendered useless. Famine lingered for years. Villages that had existed for centuries were never rebuilt. The survivors carried the scars forever, those who lived through the flood, and those born into its aftermath. For decades, the nationalist government denied responsibility. They blamed the Japanese, claiming enemy shelling had damaged the dikes. It wasn't until the 1950s that the truth emerged fully. But by then, Chiang Kai-shek had fled to Taiwan, the communists controlled the mainland, and the victims of 1938 were just another forgotten tragedy in a century that had already seen so many. For 80 years, this was treated as a wartime footnote. A strategic decision. Collateral damage. Pause, but what do you call it when a government drowns its own people to slow an enemy? When the weapon kills 1 million civilians and barely scratches the army it was aimed at? When survival meant watching your children drown because your leaders decided the land was worth more flooded than defended? Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like the kind of logic that never really goes away, the calculation that some lives are worth sacrificing for strategic goals, that populations are acceptable losses, that the map matters more than the people on it? The Yellow River flood was one of the deadliest acts of the 20th century. Not a natural disaster. A choice. And choices like that don't stay in the past. They echo. In scorched earth tactics. In cities shelter rubble because holding them helps the enemy. In populations displaced not by accident, but by design. The patterns repeat. The logic persists. Only the rivers change. The people who drowned in June 1938 didn't die in a flood. They died in a strategy meeting. They died when someone looked at a map and decided a river could be a weapon, and the people living beside it were simply in the way. They went to sleep trusting the walls that had protected them for generations. Long pause, they drowned because their leaders broke them.